Transmission costs for the Humboldt Sentinel are brought to you in part by KGOE News Talk 1480. KGOE 1480 is the predominantly progressive news talk station in Humboldt County that is also the radio home of the Humboldt Crabs.
Welcome to this episode of Sentinel Interviews. Continuing our 2012 election special, we're here with Assemblymember and congressional candidate Jared Huffman. Jared, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So Jared, what convinced you to want to step out of the fray in Sacramento and into the much deeper morass of Washington, D.C.?
That's a pretty good description, actually. Bottom line is, I like the work I do as a legislator, trying to solve problems for the people I represent. It's been a tough time. The system is broken, but I've also been able to be effective and get things done. And I think that's one of the things that we most need right now in Congress is somebody who can cut through all of this partisan paralysis and get things done. So I want to be part of that.
So for folks up here in Humboldt County, or going to be most of our audience, we're not so familiar with what the Assemblymember from basically the Marin area, I believe the 6th District, has been up to. So give folks an idea of who you are and what prompted you to get involved in public life, I believe first Water Board in Marin County and then into the State Assembly.
Yeah. So my current Assembly district starts in Sonoma County. It has about a third of Sonoma County and then all of Marin County. And really what has prompted me to get involved in all the things I've done over the last couple of decades is my concern for issues, the public interest. I started out as a young attorney representing women in civil rights cases. I did a huge case against the Cal State University system on behalf of the National Organization for Women, brought the universities into compliance with Title IX, did some more civil rights work, and then became a senior attorney at a national environmental organization, NRDC, before spending 12 years on my local water district board and going on to serve in the State Assembly. So I care about public policy. I've been at it with my shoulder to the wheel for the public interest for 2 decades, and this work really is just a natural extension of that.
So talking about getting things done, what have you gotten done in Sacramento given the gridlock and the continual, pretty much annual ritual of budget crisis? And one crisis after another in terms of prison, whether it's prison health care, whether it's a juvenile justice system, it seems like Sacramento is just a real mess.
Well, it is a mess on the natural because there's a fair amount of built-in dysfunction, but add to that the fact that we've been weathering the worst fiscal crisis since the Great Depression, and you've really got a challenge. So what have I gotten done? Let's just start most recently. Working with West Chesbro, we were able to save funding for home-to-school transportation for rural communities, which was a huge thing for Humboldt County. He and I are also working together trying to fight back this rural fire fee, also known as the SRA fire fee, which would have a terrible impact on rural communities and fire districts. We are working very hard this year to save our state parks, and I'm happy to say that I am at the forefront of that effort. And because I've been able to do my work over the last 6 years in a way that doesn't kind of burn bridges and attacks people's character and contribute to this partisan dysfunction, I'm doing that on a strongly bipartisan basis. So I have a Republican joint author for my state park stewardship bill, in addition to Mr. Chesbro, who's one of the co-authors. And I think we're going to get that done. I think we're going to move a strong bipartisan solution through this year that keeps our state parks open.
Now, of course, Mr. Chesbro did fight to get the funding back, but he and Senator Evans voted to cut the funding in the first place last year. Isn't that the sort of politics as usual in Sacramento that people are just really up to here with?
Not really, no. It's a little more complicated than that. So there's a two-part cut that the governor has sought. The first part of that cut, for parks at least, was in last year's budget.
Were these the trigger cuts that they talked about?
No. But after that budget was passed, the governor said, I want another $11 million cut, and that's what I need to close 70 parks. And at that point, I started pushing back in a big way as chair of the Parks Committee, along with Mr. Chesbro and others. And we have not voted for, or in any way, gone along with this idea of park closures. We're pushing back on it, and I think we can find better ways.
Now, of course, we're here in a high school campus, and we've seen here Eureka City schools and school districts across the North Coast some really devastating cuts. What's the solution to that? And is there a solution on the federal level that's going to help states like California?
There are solutions at both the state and federal level. So let's start with the most important thing we can do for our schools right now. Go to the polls this fall and vote for Governor Brown's tax initiative. Bottom line, we are not going to solve our problems unless we put some new tax revenues on the table for education. And what the governor's been able to put together working with the education community is the best thing we've seen in years. It's an opportunity to get $7 to $9 billion, most of which will go for K through 12 and higher ed. We desperately need it. That's critical. At the federal level, one of the most important things I hope to do as somebody who's worked on these issues for the last several years is bring federal funding to the table for special education. That's one of the areas where, in many cases, it's a major part of school districts' budgets. It's a federal mandate, and yet the federal government has really not stepped up to the plate to provide the money for that mandate, and I want to change that. Now,
it's arguable that education hasn't exactly gotten better as federal involvement has increased. Do you think at some points we ought to cut bait and run and let the states once again manage their own education systems without federal interference, like No Child Left Behind?
The federal government needs to set some basic standards that every state needs to meet. The problem that No Child Left Behind presented is not the fact that it had strong accountability measures. You need some accountability. You don't want to go back to the point where kids are graduating school and can't count money and other problems like that. And you're going to need some testing and some good curriculum standards. But one of the problems with No Child Left Behind is it didn't distinguish between states that set very high standards, such as California, and states that set very low ones, such as Mississippi. And so what that's done is in California, testing has become everything. Those test scores are critical because if we don't, by our own high standards, put up good scores, No Child Left Behind also has some very punitive elements that begin to punish schools. They put them into program improvement. At some point, they lose funding. They have to jump through all these bureaucratic hoops. It's way too inflexible, and we need to recognize, certainly not punish the setting of high standards, allow enough flexibility in there for places like California that want to set high standards to not be punished by setting those high standards.
But at what point does funding the Department of Education fund bureaucrats in Washington and not teachers actually in the trenches in districts like this one?
I've heard those arguments from Republicans about we need to get rid of the Department of Education. I think we need a Department of Education. If we can find efficiencies in it, that's great, because I want every dollar to the greatest extent possible to go to classrooms and not to bureaucracy. But I think we need a Department of Education.
Moving on to the environments, a real divide in this district, this new North Coast district stretching from Marin to Del Norte County, is the water divide. Humboldt's pretty much a donor of water, and Mendocino, southern part of it, and Sonoma and Marin counties are the recipients. I'm sure you've heard the joke that if they've discovered water on Mars, the Sonoma County Water Agency immediately claim credit to it. Where do you come down on the water politics and how that creates a divide politically in our district?
First thing is you got to say the same thing in Humboldt County that you're saying in Mendocino and Sonoma and Marin County. You got to be honest with people. And I can promise you I am very consistent in what I'm saying on both sides of those watersheds. And the reason I can do that is because this is actually not a very new issue to me. I ran for the water board in Marin County back in 1994 in large part to prevent a project that would have increased Marin County's reliance on North Coast rivers. There was a project to build a pipeline to draw more water down through the Sonoma County Water Agency system. I opposed that. I still oppose that. So I'm just carrying on the same position I've always had. I think every part of the state should be, to the greatest extent possible, self-sufficient when it comes to their water supply. I think importing water from faraway places is bad policy. It has caused an awful lot of environmental damage. And as we go forward in California, if you look at some of our real vulnerabilities, millions of people that are depending on the Delta for water supply, which is one of the most fragile places in terms of the levees, in terms of sea level rise, in terms of the long distances that water is transported. We need to be more regionally self-sufficient in every part of the state of California.
Take a minute and let folks around here who might not have even ever been to the Sacramento Delta, don't really know about that ecosystem. I know you've been criticized by, again, folks down south more familiar with those issues regarding state legislation that would allow for a peripheral canal. Tell folks, what is this delta,
Right.
Why is it a sensitive ecosystem, and what is this peripheral canal that's been pushed for decades, and what's your actual position on it?
Well, the first thing is a continuing education challenge. For example, the state legislation I was part of doesn't even speak to a peripheral canal. There is this perception that it somehow does, it really doesn't. What it does do is put in place some very high standards for the environment, for in-delta interests, for California water law, basically, that are going to have to be met regardless of what the conveyance solution is in the next 50 years. If it's fixing the through delta conveyance system, it's going to have to meet these high standards. If it's some kind of another facility, and I'm not persuaded that that can be done feasibly or environmentally in an environmentally responsible way, it's going to now have to meet super high standards that weren't on the books before I was able to work on this legislation. So I'm really proud of what I've done. I think it's put in place some incredibly important safeguards that are going to serve us very well on the North Coast in terms of preventing greater pressure on diversions from the Trinity River and other parts of Northern California, and also for the Delta estuary and the ecosystem.
And why is that ecosystem under threat by a peripheral canal? Basically, it's the Sacramento River spilling into the San Francisco Bay Area, and this would draw water out of it for cities, farmland?
We could probably spend a whole show on this, but the bottom line is that estuary, that confluence of the Sacramento and San Joaquin River system, is the most important, ecologically important estuary on the west coast of either North or South America. Even in its abused state today, it sustains incredibly important species. It is the mainstay of the commercial and recreational fishing industry here on the North Coast, and it's in trouble. All of the indicators are that, and even before you talk about a peripheral canal, right now the system is in trouble. So we've got to do some major changes if we're going to save the Delta estuary and the fisheries and other species that depend on it. And that's why those standards that I put in place are so critically important.
Now, in terms of water quality, there's been local supervisors like Mark Lovelace who've been really sounding the call against the environmentally destructive practices of growers. And that's been a theme you've seen up and down the coast. But of course, Mark Lovelace is talking about pot growers, and other folks are talking about wine growers and the use of toxic pesticides.
Mm-hmm.
And where do you come down on actually being firm when we say we're going to ban something like methyl bromide? We actually go ahead and do it and not keep pushing back the ban, as has happened.
I have been at the forefront of the call to eliminate methyl bromide. So to go to your specific example, you're going to find my record on environmental issues as strong as anyone, and I'm very proud of that. That's probably why I have every environmental group endorsement in this race. But you're also going to find many years of examples where I've done more than just sort of stake out hardline positions. I've tried to work on solutions that work for everyone. I'm convinced that we can have a thriving agricultural economy and a resource economy and also meet very high standards for our environmental values. They can work together. You got to often work a little harder and more creatively to find those win-wins, but it's possible.
So speaking of win-wins, you've been trying to push for a non-water-based alternative to frost prevention, because that's been a big criticism with these sprawling vineyards that have sprung up over the last 20 years, northern Sonoma, southern Mendocino counties, where draining local aquifers to basically prevent grapes from freezing in winter. It doesn't seem like the best use of water.
Not necessarily non-water based, although we want to encourage that. You know, if they can put in the fans and the thermal systems, that's great. That takes that diversion out for frost protection. What I've been pushing is off-stream storage facilities for their frost protection when they do need to use water, so that when it's 2 a.m. in April, and you've got your juvenile salmon depending on flows in a stream, every grower doesn't turn on their pumps, suddenly draw that stream down and kill the fish. If they can instead turn on systems from small ponds that are constructed for frost protection, that's a win-win, again, for everybody. I passed a bill last year that really streamlines the ability to do that, and it's supported by fishing groups and the environmental community as well as wine grape growers.
You're watching Sentinel Interviews here at the Access Humboldt Community Media Center in Eureka. We're here with Assemblymember and congressional candidate Jared Huffman, speaking about environmental issues, speaking about those growers now on this end, more the marijuana growers. Where do you come down on the federal government's basically drumming back up the drug war that Obama promised he was going to push to the wayside if medical marijuana patients were following applicable state laws? He's kind of done a 180 and said, okay, now we're going to go after everybody, seize the property of dispensaries, and really drive the price of this illegal crop right back up.
Yeah, I oppose the way they have been conducting those raids and enforcement actions. In a sense, they've been punishing the best actors in many cases, folks that have been trying to run legitimate, decent medical cannabis operations. I think the challenge for us here is to acknowledge, even for someone like me that favors a long-term, decriminalization, legalize, tax, regulate approach to marijuana, that's not going to happen at the federal level probably for a number of years. And so what we have to do is bring some coherence and integrity to the medical cannabis system. We need some regulations in place, either at the local level or, if possible, at the state level, and I'm working on that this year with Assemblymember Tom Amiano, so that we can go back to the federal government and say, look, we've got a robust regulatory framework in place for medical cannabis. It has integrity. It's not a charade. It's not hiding trafficking and abuse. It's real. Therefore, leave these guys alone. Focus your enforcement on the illegal grows on public land, on private land that are causing so much environmental damage, causing public safety issues. That's my goal. That's what I'm going to work on.
The president and his administration has said, well, we don't have the authority to push back the regs on marijuana, but of course the Controlled Substances Act gives the executive branch the specific authority to schedule these drugs. What's to stop the president from moving marijuana from a Schedule 1 to a Schedule 3?
Well, I think they should. That's one part of the solution. But the other piece is that we've got to, I think, persuade them that they should show deference to states on medical cannabis. I mean, more and more states are enacting medical cannabis policies. So at some point, the federal government really has to decide, is it going to continue this war on drugs and this overreaching preemption of state authority, or can we find some kind of balance where, at least on the medical cannabis, they leave states alone if they've got a good regulatory framework in place, focus on the bad stuff that we can all agree needs to stop. And then over time, I have no doubt that this country is going to sort of relearn the lessons of prohibition and bring some kind of legalization framework into place. But that's probably going to take a few years.
Now, the less justifiable drugs in our society, the opiates, cocaine, and so forth, Mark Leno over there on the state capitol has proposed another bill to bump down to misdemeanors the simple possession of drugs. That will be in line with, I believe, 13 other states, with D.C., and with the federal government's own law. Yeah. Why has the state been dragging its feet in doing that?
I need to take a look at that bill. We have dozens of bills relating to the scheduling of different substances every year, so I haven't seen Mr. Leno's bill, but I'll take a look.
And in terms of on the national level, you said you've been fighting for civil rights, women's rights in particular. On the national level, we've seen a real attack on women's rights, but we've also seen a real attack on basic privacy. Yeah. Just in a quick boilerplate, where do you come down on privacy versus security? And what Ben Franklin had to say about that.
Right. Well, first, always beware of false choices. I don't know that you necessarily have to choose between our security and privacy. They should be able to coexist almost always. And when privacy needs to give way to security, that should always be a very exceptional circumstance. It should not be some broad discretionary tool that the administration gets to apply, whenever it sees fit. And that's the problem with some of the laws that we've put on the books in recent years. So I hope to be part of fixing that. I am a civil libertarian. I strongly believe in privacy and civil liberties, and we've got work to do.
In terms of CISPA, it just got through the House. Representative Mike Thompson was a co-sponsor of it. It's now in the Senate. Do you feel that President Obama is correct when he says this is a threat to people's basic privacy and that there aren't enough safeguards to prevent the misuse of people's personal information, not just by the government, but by private corporations like Google and Facebook?
Well, I think we need to take a look at that. That's the balancing act we're trying to do, but I think it's certainly SOPA and PIPA were not the right answer. I think Mike Thompson is working on a better approach, a more targeted approach. I'm going to need to read the bill, and It's interesting, you can ask congressional candidates questions like that, and rarely do they acknowledge, well, gee, I haven't read that bill. We're sort of conditioned to always have opinions, but I'm going to be honest with you, I need to read that bill, and I will make my own decision about whether it meets my standard for protecting the personal privacy and civil liberty side.
Well, regardless of specific legislation, have you observed this general trend since basically 9/11? Since
Absolutely. Patriot Act, on and on, absolutely. The pendulum, I think, has swung too far in the direction of eroding perhaps due process, privacy, civil liberties. And I think it's time to regroup.
You're listening to Sentinel Interviews. Charles Douglas here with Assemblymember Jared Huffman, who's running for U.S. Congress. As far as the campaign mechanics itself, there's been a lot of money thrown into this district, both from inside and outside. Obviously, some of your opponents have been getting more money from outside the district. What's your opinion on the campaign finance reform system, or is there one? Has it just completely broken down?
Well, there's not much of one right now. I've always been a supporter. I mean, you're going to find me supporting the full measure of campaign finance reform. I want to see public campaign financing. Always have. I think a candidate should have to earn a certain amount of money in small contributions to show that they're viable and that they actually deserve to be part of the public financing system. After that, I think the public financing system should pretty much take over. And candidates should be running for office based on their message, their qualifications, not spending all their time raising money. That said, the Supreme Court has made it virtually impossible to have that kind of a system right now. So we're going to need a constitutional amendment to definitely overturn Citizens United, probably go even further than that in terms of making it very clear that Congress can put in place meaningful expenditure limits, contribution limits, regulation. We need to just outlaw independent expenditures, in my opinion. There's no place for that kind of distortion in the electoral process. So we've got a lot of work to do.
Except, of course, independent expenditures. I mean, to what extent does that bind the hands of even not-for-profit groups to speak out on issues that are concerned about?
Well, speaking out is one thing. Running television ads and doing what we've seen these super PACs do, and this incredible excess and distortion is just a complete corruption of the system. And I think there's a way to have your sort of basic expression like a nonprofit might choose to do or a group might choose to do to its members without allowing Pandora's box of super PAC excess.
Of course, Citizens United was more about independent expenditures and throwing money to speak ill of a certain candidate. I think in that case it was Hillary Clinton when she was running for president. But public financing, the Supreme Court hasn't outlawed at all. Isn't that more of a problem of political will and simply, well, we don't want to spend public funds on paying for politicians' campaigns?
Well, the problem is public financing only works if you have incentives to get people into the public financing system. And when all of your opponents, are free to go out and raise a lot more money and overwhelm you in that way, public financing doesn't really work. You need meaningful incentives, and that means you got to have some contribution and expenditure limits. Those are what the Supreme Court has said you can't really do, not just in Citizens United, but Buckley versus Vallejo and other rulings over the last 20, 30 years.
Moving on to foreign policy, I know your experience is more with domestic policy, what's going on in Marin County in California, but what do you think about the U.S.'s role in the world in a general sense?
Well, I certainly think it's better today than it was 4 years ago under the Bush administration. I don't agree with everything that President Obama has done on foreign policy. I certainly want to get us out of Afghanistan now. I think the only mission we had there was accomplished quite a while ago, and it's time to bring our troops home. Other than that, though, I give the president pretty high marks on his foreign policy. I think in the Middle East he's done some positive things, reaching out to the Muslim world in a very constructive way after years in which the United States was just, frankly, arrogant and swaggering with our foreign policy. That's pretty essential if we're going to reestablish our credibility in the world and if we're going to play a meaningful role in the peace process between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And I think the president has struck exactly the right note on that delicate issue, urging both sides to get to the table for a two-state solution, pushing the economic and diplomatic solution in Iran, trying to quell this loose talk of war. So in general, I give him good marks on foreign policy.
Before diving too much into the Middle East, looking a little bit closer to home, there was just a summit of Latin American nations, I believe it was down in Colombia.
Yes.
And they were all pretty unanimous saying, America, what's wrong with you? Your drug war is killing us. And we're certainly seeing that not just in the drug cartels of South America, but along the border with Mexico.
Yeah, well, I agree. Frankly, I think the fact that we haven't come to terms with legalization of marijuana has had implications, on the subject that you just raised, at least with respect to Mexico. And certainly the interdictions and other quasi-military or military responses to this drug problem have just failed miserably. So we've got a lot of work to do there. I think we need to reinvest in our relationships in this hemisphere, in the economies of our neighbors to the south. I think that is going to go a long way, not only towards our own economic prosperity, but towards addressing some of these immigration problems that we struggle with all the time.
On immigration, what's your solution?
My solution would be a comprehensive immigration reform. And by that I mean we need to give the millions of undocumented folks in this country a path to citizenship, not amnesty. We don't hand them a citizenship status, but allow them to be here in this country, continuing to work, be part of our economies while they earn their way to citizenship. And I think you're going to have to pay your taxes, you're going to have to learn English, and certainly play by the rules and stay out of trouble to do that. But that would be a big part of comprehensive reform. I'm a big supporter of the DREAM Act, because I think anyone who's willing to serve in the military or get a college degree that's gotten themselves into our universities should have a leg up in becoming a citizen of this country. Other reforms, visa reform to get the kind of high-skilled workers that we need in this country. We're going to need immigrants to fill some of those spots because, frankly, we've not been investing in those subject areas in our education system the last few years. We need to start that investing now, but for the next few years, immigration is going to play a critical role in meeting our need for the economy. And then the Immigration Startup Act, all sorts of reforms like that. Anyone who wants to come to this country and bring capital and job creation to the problems of our economy, we should be welcoming that and finding a way to let them do it with a visa instead of driving them out to go create jobs in other countries. So those are a few of the answers. There's more to it than that, but those are some top-line responses.
Of course, there's always a flip side to some of the investment ideas you talk about. So here we had a pulp mill that a Chinese firm came in, reopened. I think it was Lee and Man Paper Company. And within a couple of years, they had big environmental problems, a series of controversial hearings in front of our local air quality management district, and then they just up and close shop.
Yeah.
Overall, do you think foreign investment is always the solution, or do we need more capital creation here at home?
Well, of course, I prefer the capital creation here at home, but look, any kind of investment in this country right now is something that I think is a good thing. It doesn't mean you don't hold them to the same high standards as everyone else. So that's an example of no one's got a monopoly on bad action and bad projects and bad management, and that sounds like a pretty good example of that.
Well, in terms of job creation, the small business folks I talk to say the problem isn't that they don't know how to write a business plan or some of the other advice the SBDC or SBA would give them. They need the capital.
Absolutely.
And the whole bailout system has really benefited the banks and the Wall Street hedge funds and investment firms.
Right. We
haven't seen that money reinvested, at least here locally in Humboldt County.
We absolutely need to find ways to incentivize and perhaps mandate that big banks get back in the game of lending to small businesses. There's a few ways that we can do that. And my interest in this, I think, is one of the reasons why I'm endorsed by the California Small Business Association. I'm a candidate that has the rare honor of being supported by the leading business groups, labor groups, and environmental groups in the state of California. And I think that speaks a lot to what I bring to this race. But one way we can do it is to allow credit unions to do business lending. Now, the big banks for years have kept credit unions out of business lending. Anyone who wants to do business lending right now in this economy should be allowed to do it. I think it's great that we open the door to crowdsourcing and other creative ways to raise capital for small businesses, but credit unions can be part of it. The other thing is our big banks have record amounts of cash parked at the Federal Reserve, while our small businesses are crying for capital. So we need to start charging them instead of paying them basis points to park cash and idle it, basically, instead of stimulating the economy. Other countries have done this. The United States needs to urge the Fed to do that, and that's part of our problem right now.
There's also proposals in Sacramento to create a state bank like North Dakota has.
Yeah.
So where do you come down on that?
Well, I've voted for the study of it. We couldn't get it passed, but I think it's worth a look. I absolutely think it's worth a look.
Now, in terms of that bailout that happened right in the middle of the presidential campaign last time around, Mike Thompson voted against it, and then a few days later, after massive calls for not doing so, he turned around and voted for it.
Right.
And we've seen not only the TARP money spent flagrantly, but we've seen trillions more dollars as come out in congressional hearings basically being shoveled not only into hedge funds and the mega banks on Wall Street, but actually into foreign banks in Europe. Do you think that there's like an investigation needed?
I do. I would love to see more accountability and certainly more disclosure about that, because we need, at a minimum, we need to learn from it. Perhaps, though, there may need to be some individual or some corporate liability associated with that accountability. But here's the situation. I don't fault Congressman Thompson or anyone else who voted for that, because at that point in time, you had every major official in the United States and I think the rest of the world saying the whole financial system globally could come crashing down if you don't act now. And so given that situation, I think flawed as it was, the action that was taken was necessary. We did not, you don't have time for brinksmanship at that point. And voting for a flawed measure, I think, was the only choice that was before him at the time. So let's learn from it. I hope we never have to do it again, but if we do, certainly let's make sure that we don't do it in a way that allows that money to go to executive bonuses and other abuses and inappropriate items that we never would have wanted to get the money.
Well, I think Matt Taibbi called Goldman Sachs a vampire squid latched onto the face of humanity. At what point do antitrust measures come into play here? Do these mega banks that are too big to fail need to be broken up into smaller pieces that can fail and can play by the same market rules everyone else does?
Yeah, I think they should certainly have to be considered under the light of the antitrust laws. I wouldn't rule that out.
You're here with Jared Huffman. I'm Charles Douglas here at Access Humboldt Community Media Center, heading into the final segment of Sentinel interviews, getting into trade policy.
Yeah.
To what extent has our trade policy exacerbated our failing financial system and our real high unemployment rate?
Yeah.
As you probably know, the unemployment rate, the way it's measured, has been recalibrated over the years. If you looked at the unemployment rate the way it was measured some decades ago, we're really upwards of 15, almost 20% unemployment.
Yeah. Well, I think it's been a part of it, and there's a real challenge when it comes to trade policy. We want access to other markets for our companies to compete. That can be a very good thing. But when we do it in a way that lets them access those markets, but then shift all of the manufacturing and the production of goods to other countries as they access those markets, and then park all of that, all those earnings offshore, that's a big part of what has contributed to our problems. So we need to get tougher. We need to require fair trade as well as free trade. We want access to markets, but we don't want to do it in a way that contributes to a race to the bottom, countries that don't have minimal labor standards and environmental standards. That's not okay. The other thing we're going to have to do is be less of a cheap date, if you will, with China. I mean, I understand that China's a very powerful economic force right now and an important trading partner, but they are just engaging in abusive practices all over the place, whether it's slapping tariffs on our goods or manipulating their currency in a way that makes it almost impossible for us to compete with a lot of manufactured goods. That's got to change, and I think the United States needs to stand up constructively. This doesn't have to be super provocative. It's about fairness. That needs to happen.
In terms of the bailout of General Motors, it looks like some government money is actually going towards General Motors. Okay, they stayed afloat, but now they're getting subsidies to build factories in Brazil and in China. Mm-hmm. To what extent does some of these trade policies need to be recalibrated to actually foster manufacturing here at home?
Well, we need to do a lot to foster manufacturing here at home. To the extent that we can leverage General Motors away from those decisions, I would like to do it. One of the things that we have to do, though, that is sometimes lost in this discussion, is we've got to invest in our productivity in this country. There's a huge amount of capital all over the planet, not just in this country, but all over the planet, that's sort of waiting to be invested based on two factors. One is cost, what is cheapest. The second is productivity. And I don't think we're going to necessarily compete on the cost basis. That's a race to the bottom. We're never going to be the cheapest place to make widgets, especially today. We absolutely can be the most productive place. That's what we did. That's how we won the future after World War II. We built the interstate highway system. We had a strong labor force and strong labor laws and trade unions, and we were the most productive country the world had ever seen. We need to get back to that by reinvesting in infrastructure, by reinvesting in education, especially the STEM subject areas, and with those forward-looking investments, we can win the future, not a race to the bottom, but a race to the top with our own productivity. That's where I think we need to focus.
Talking about that race to the bottom, the World Trade Organization has been enforcing rules using that whole treaty clause in the Constitution to say, well, you can't have rules preventing environmental degradation if that's an unfair barrier to trade. Same with labor laws. Do you think the World Trade Organization and the U.S. relationship with it needs to be re-examined?
Yeah, well, absolutely. We're not going to let trade agreements trump our environmental standards. You will never find me supporting policies in that direction. So if that means getting tough with the WTO or anyone else, we need to do it. And
would you say the same thing about NAFTA?
Absolutely. Yeah, we have the problem with Mexican trucks and any number of other examples where we have this tension between the standards we've set and our free trade goals. I am not for a race to the bottom. If we're going to have free trade, it needs to be fair trade. That means Mexican trucks have to conform with our safety and environmental standards in order to enjoy that trade relationship.
And you're speaking about organized labor. It does seem like, looking around here in Humboldt County, the organized labor is almost collapsed. You have healthcare, education, maybe government unions, but the rest of them have almost entirely gone by the wayside. Yeah. Why has that happened, in your view?
In large part, it's that we've lost the middle class economy that was the mainstay of our economy in the decades after World War II.
And is that a chicken and the egg thing? Do we lose the unions because we lost those middle class manufacturing jobs, or?
I think they go together, frankly. I think a strong union movement was totally part and parcel of the economic strength that our country enjoyed in the decades after World War II. And I think the fact that, as you observe, that we've lost a lot of that union membership is a sign of the decay in our middle class, and we need to get it back. So let's not again look at a race to the bottom where we've got to go to like minimal standards, wages, other workplace standards. Let's invest in the future, a race to the top, productivity, infrastructure, education, strong union jobs, union standards. It works together.
Now, one area where it's important to low-wage workers, but we haven't seen the unions terribly active on it, is the minimum wage. We haven't seen an increase in the state minimum wage for a longer period of time than the feds have raised theirs, although, of course, the state's still a little bit higher at $8 an hour. Yeah. What have you done to try to get state minimum wage to actually keep up with the cost of living?
Well, I've supported it, but I can't manufacture other votes in a legislature, and so you can only do what you can do as an individual. Sometimes the votes haven't been there to do it. I think the tough economic times we've been in have been a big part of that.
But of course, the Democrats are in charge in Sacramento. They've had a majority in both houses for over 10 years now. Well, what's the holdup?
Well, we had a Republican governor for most of that time. Sure. So remember the veto power and other factors.
So Jerry Brown's in there now.
Jerry Brown's in there now.
So what is the holdup?
So, I'm not aware of minimum wage legislation moving right now. So I don't know what the leadership has discussed with the governor, whether they consider that too divisive as he wants to get his tax measure passed. And right now, Jerry Brown's focused on one thing only, and that is passing his tax measure that we discussed at the beginning of this interview under the education subject. So.
Okay, looking into the tax measures. According to the polling I'm reading, the tax on millionaires, that's doing really well. That'll probably pass. Sales tax not doing so well. And again, just like the minimum wage, that's something that really hits those low-wage workers the most. Yeah.
Well, you're talking about the Munger measure versus Governor Brown's measure? Mm-hmm. I've seen conflicting polling. I think the governor's measure is polling at least as well, if not better, than the Munger measure. So we're going to just have to see. I think a far broader coalition is supporting what the governor's trying to do here. I agree with you. I would rather it not include the 0.25 cent sales tax element, but what the governor is trying to do is build that broad coalition, and there are folks in the business community who say it can't just be all on the rich. It needs to also have some broad policy to it. So that's the compromise that's reflected there.
So I said we'd get back to the Middle East. Okay, so we're sort of out of Iraq, and the president went and did kind of the victory lap in Afghanistan, but of course there are more troops now there today than when the Obama administration started.
Yeah.
You and Thompson are on the same page there.
Absolutely.
We need to get out of Afghanistan right away. Well, what about Libya, though? It seemed like NATO went in with a huge bombing campaign, a lot of civilian casualties. Sure, Gaddafi's dead, and he was not a nice guy, but what's replaced him except chaos and interscene conflict and the black Libyans getting really massacred? It does seem like the situation now is worse than it was a year ago in Libya.
Libya is a good example of many other places in the world where your choices are not good versus bad. Your choices are bad and worse. I think the president made the right call in Libya. I don't agree with the process that he followed. He should have gone to Congress before our military got involved in that action. And certainly if I'm a member of Congress, I'm going to be very vigilant in making sure that our military is not committed without full engagement and approval of the House of Representatives and the Senate.
As far as those presidential war powers, we had, I think it's the defense secretary, who's from right here in California, say, well, we got UN authorization, we don't need you, Congress.
Yeah.
I mean,
well, something happens to people when they get in the executive branch, and I think they just come to look at things differently. But I'm running for Congress, and I think my job as a member of Congress is to be very vigilant about congressional approval of military commitments.
and as far as the defense budget overall, do you think it's too big, too bloated? Is that part of our deficit problem?
I absolutely do. Yeah, I think we have forward deployments and bases all over the world in a way that is left over from a Cold War that ended a couple decades ago. It's just hard to justify that kind of huge global presence when you look at our real security interests today. We can be secure, we can be strong without hemorrhaging so much of our budget on things that don't contribute to our gross domestic product.
I've been looking at the congressional reps over the last few decades here in the North Coast. With the exception of one, it doesn't seem like it's based on self-interest even. We don't have large defense industries or large military bases in our district. So why do we vote for huge military funding when we're not feeling safer and we're not even seeing any real economic benefit?
Well, I'm certainly going to ask that question. I think there's a lot of room for budget savings in the defense area without sacrificing our national security. Of course, you know how it works. Everybody knows how it works for these major weapon systems and bases and things like that. They're rather strategically doled out to congressional districts, and there are a lot of members of Congress who are afraid to vote against defense authorizations for that reason. So the fact that we don't have that pressure here because we don't have the kind of bases and weapon system manufacturing here, I think gives you an opportunity to ask the hard questions, maybe even more so than some in other districts would have.
I'd be remiss before we wrap up to not touch on healthcare. Obviously, Obamacare, the individual mandate, we'll see what the Supreme Court has to say about that. Do you think requiring people to buy insurance from a private corporation is really providing people with universal health care?
It's not ideal, but again, we can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. I think the Affordable Care Act is a hugely important incremental improvement in a broken healthcare system. To give you one example, I ran into a guy 2 nights ago, a friend of mine who we thought was going to die a few weeks ago. He got cancer throughout his lymph nodes and was on death's door. Right as he was being diagnosed with cancer, he had lapsed coverage, he had changed jobs. And fortunately, he Googled cancer, no insurance coverage, and it came up with Affordable Care Act. They now have to give you coverage because pre-existing condition no longer is a reason for denying coverage. This guy's alive today. He is going to survive because of the treatment he got and the coverage that he got under the Affordable Care Act. And I'm hearing more and more examples of that. So I don't think people should be too dismissive or trivialize the huge accomplishment that we got. It's not ideal. I support single-payer health care. I want to see a national health insurance system where this mandate thing won't even be part of it. I want to see health insurance decoupled from employment so that you don't ever have to worry about what your job is and, gosh, will I have insurance coverage? It should just follow you wherever you go. But those are going to be long-term goals. And for now, we need to defend the very, very important reform we got a few years ago.
With the gridlock in Washington, single payer in that level admittedly isn't much hope for that just yet. Right. But state-based single payer, there is legislation that is moving in Sacramento on that count.
Well, it's not moving anymore, unfortunately, but I have co-authored such legislation every year that I've been in the state assembly, and I will continue to support it, whether at the state level or the federal level. But unfortunately, it looks like that bill, SB 810, is not going to move this year.
Coupling a couple of those issues back with your record on the environment, do you think we focus too much on treatment of cancer or other chronic ailments and not enough on the causes? We've seen this huge spike in breast cancer rates, prostate cancer rates. People want to blame the bad diets or what have you, but to what extent is it environmental contamination a big part of that?
Well, we don't know the answer to that. You could also look at other epidemics, if you will. I mean, the fact that something like 2 or 3% of children now have autism. There's all kinds of examples that are, I think, red flags, urging us to look at our environment and ask hard questions about the exposures that we have. So it's not a choice. It's not that we should not be spending on treatment. We need the treatment, but we also need, I think, a forward-looking policy on these public health issues. And in that regard, I'm really proud that I authored in California the Green Chemistry Law, which has the promise to do just that, to get out of this situation where when we finally get through battling through the science and decide something is killing us, then we decide whether to ban it. Well, we need to be doing that at the front end before we approve these substances to go on the market, to be in products that we put in our bodies and we surround ourselves with. We need to know they're safe. The Green Chemistry Law in California is the best thing that anyone in this country has done yet. It hasn't achieved its mission quite yet, but it has the promise to be that kind of a policy.
And another bill you've pushed, I understand, regards GMO fish, these genetically modified salmon. There's a GMO labeling initiative coming on the ballot here in California in November. Where do you stand on that?
Well, you won't be surprised to know I support it. I think the law that the bill that I authored that came up short to require labeling of GMO salmon kind of set the stage for that initiative. In fact, I was working with a lot of the groups that are pushing the initiative on the bill. With salmon, it's such an easy call. I mean, we need to require that kind of labeling for all kinds of reasons. The fact that they've been able to splice in a gene from a warm water fish, a pout, and make a salmon grow 3-4 times the size and at faster rates than a wild salmon is pretty alarming. I think consumers want to know what they're getting when that kind of a product goes on the shelves. Of course, that kind of stuff is also a direct threat to our wild salmon populations to the extent that these fish escape and interbreed and spread disease and so on. So we got a lot of work to do on that, and California, unfortunately, hasn't been able to get it done. I was not able to pass my bill because of opposition in Sacramento, so I want to pick that up and keep working on it in Congress.
So I've got to hit you with a tough question to round things out. You were at a house party recently here with the unnamed supervisor, and folks were asked, what do you think your big weakness is? I understand Ms. Lawson said she didn't have one, or she couldn't think of one, and if that isn't telling, I don't know what is. But you did have an answer, and you said, well, I'm in Sacramento, and I'm part of the state governments that's not highly popular right now. We're looking at a Congress with, 9% approval rating? Something really, used car salesmen are more respected at this point. Why are you not part of the Democratic machine and not part of the province of Sacramento?
Well, thanks for the question. So the question that was asked to me at that house party was, what are people going to sling at you in this campaign that they'll allege is your Achilles heel? And I said, well, if I were on the other side, I would argue that, look, he's been part of the state legislature, and they haven't done so well. That has been tried. My opponents are bringing that up all the time. The situation, though, is that voters are a little smarter than that. They're able to look at an individual and assess whether they have been part of the problem that the institution suffers from, or whether they've been trying to improve the institution and actually finding ways to get things done even within that dysfunctional institution. So anyone who's willing to take the time to ask that question and look at it is going to see that I think I've been part of the solution, or tried to be at least. I have broken with my party when necessary to support reforms. I have been able to get things done and pass legislation. I have not gotten involved in the partisan food fights. You don't see me engaged in the character attacks and other things that are kind of grinding the system into gridlock. So that's all I can do, is point out what I've done. I'm actually proud of the fact that I've been a legislator and I've approached my job in that way. That's what you need to send to Washington. And if you don't have that experience, if you haven't been in the fray and actually shown some success in it, it's going to be very hard going back to Washington and actually finding ways to get things done.
So I know Congressman Thompson's behind you. Here's the ultra tough question. Where do you and he part ways? What would you say is a good example of a disagreement you've had with the incumbent congressman?
You know, I haven't studied Mike Thompson's long record to see which votes I might have gone differently on. And
well, we talked about war funding. We talked about Libya. We talked about the bailouts. Any of those?
Yeah, well, you know, Libya would be one. Again, I don't know exactly what Mike said during those debates or how he voted, but I would have certainly been demanding that the president consult and get approval from Congress. So, but I think the truth is I've got far more in common with Mike Thompson than any disagreements we may be able to find if we put votes under the microscope. He's worked very hard for this district. He's been a champion for the fishing industry and for a sustainable resource economy, for wilderness, for environmental values, coastal protection. You're going to see a lot of continuation with me in Congress when it comes to that legacy.
Well, he's been a Blue Dog Democrat, Wine Caucus. Would you be part of the Progressive Caucus if you're in Washington? I
will. I will caucus with the Progressive Caucus, but I will also say this. Those aren't the only people I'll talk to. I'm going to work with everybody. If I can find alliances and coalitions with Blue Dogs, with Republicans, with whomever, I will. And the truth is, if you look at my record the last 6 years as a state legislator, that's exactly what I've done.
I know last thing I got in the mail from Mike Thompson was a sponge on your behalf.
Ah, yes.
Now, sponge, that's a great representative of our aquatic ecosystem, but they don't have backbones. Are you a vertebrate?
Well, let's not dangle this metaphor too much. Yes, I am a vertebrate, but that sponge, I think, symbolizes keeping it clean, keeping our environment clean, running a clean campaign. And I think that's another way in which my campaign has been different. You haven't seen me drawn into these nasty food fights that, you know, frankly, there's a lot of crossfire now between some of my opponents over voting records and manipulations of things on the internet and so on. I'm trying to stay above that fray. And the reason is I've got a record. I can, I think, win this race by talking about my qualifications, what I have done, which is, of course, the best indication of what I will do in Congress. And I'm going to stay on message in that regard.
So you've got the big money, though. So how can you guarantee the voters that the big money coming in, not just from labor unions,
right,
but from some business groups, some wine industry groups, isn't going to influence your positions in D.C.?
Money's never influenced me in the past, so again, I get to point to my record. You can find any number of contributions over the last 6 years and speculate about, gosh, was there influence? Did that change anything? But if you look at my record, 100% pro-consumer. You're not going to find a stronger consumer champion in the legislature. You're not going to find a stronger environmental record. And you're not going to find a stronger champion on choice and senior protection and any number of other things. My core democratic values have always been very, very strong. And you just have to put a firewall in place. I don't like this money system one bit. But you know what I say at my fundraisers, even to the people that I want to write me checks, because you have to raise money to run, I say, the only thing it gets you is somebody that's going to support good government and good policy. So that's the bad news. There's no influence. It just doesn't work that way, at least with this member.
You had to bring up the old folks, so I've got to ask. Social Security, Medicare, we heard a lot of scare tactics. It's on the edge of collapse 25 years from now. It doesn't sound like the edge of collapse.
It's not on the edge of collapse.
And really, where do you come down as far as privatization, good or bad, and where do you come down on how to fix the system? Is it raising the retirement age? Is it raising the payroll deduction cap?
Well, it's certainly raising the payroll deduction cap as part of Social Security. If you do that, if you simply do what Simpson-Bowles recommended on that wage cap, you're a long way towards stabilizing Social Security funding well into the next generation. But the most important thing we can do is get more people into the workforce. Younger people right now that are looking for work, the long-term unemployed. We talked about immigration a little bit earlier. We've got millions of people in this country that are sort of in this off-the-books economy. Great thing about comprehensive immigration reform is we can bring them into the system too. So those are the things that will move the needle in a big, big way and stabilize both Medicare and Social Security, and I will not allow any reduction in benefits or any privatization schemes.
So as far as staying accountable to the voters, obviously you're from Marin, we're way the heck up here. Would you pledge to the voters now that you'll be willing to sit down in forums just like this, maybe even on live television instead of recorded, and do a Q&A with the voters here in Humboldt County?
Of course. Absolutely. No, you know, one of the reasons I think Mike Thompson has been such a strong brand here in the North Coast is that he's been here. He's been kind of part of this community. He's worked very hard for it, and I am absolutely committed to doing that.
Again,
you'll see a lot of me, and in part it's because I'm a fisherman, and frankly, even before I ran for this office, I was up here fishing the Trinity and other rivers. I love this place, and I will be a regular presence.
Yeah, I didn't know you were a fisherman.
Yeah.
I thought you were a volleyball player.
I'm that too.
That's what your bias said. You've been watching Sentinel Interviews. I'm Charles Douglas here at the Access Humboldt Community Media Center. I'd like to thank Gabrielle in the control room, Lilach out here on the floor, Jared Huffman, Assemblymember and candidate for U.S. Congress.
Thank you, Charles.
Thanks so much for joining us.
Appreciate it.
Enjoy your guys' circle jerk.
So were you told you couldn't let your children play?
Yeah, gave me a ticket to boot. I don't know what.